There is a story buried in the middle of Ohio that most Americans have never fully heard, and it begins not at Kitty Hawk, not on some windswept Carolina beach, but in a bicycle repair shop on the west side of Dayton. A shop so ordinary that the mailman walked right past it every single day for years, while history was being assembled inside. Here's the part that gets me every time I think about it. On the morning of December 17th, 1903, the most important thing to ever happen in the history of human transportation took place, and exactly 5 people were there to see it. 5. A moment that would permanently change how human beings move across this planet, and the audience was 5 men standing in the cold on a North Carolina beach. And when the brothers sent a telegram home to Dayton that afternoon to share the news, the newspapers mostly ignored it. One reporter heard the story and decided it wasn't credible enough to print on the front page. The world's first powered, controlled, sustained flight, and it got buried somewhere between the weather report and the local business listings. But here's the thing. The real story of how aviation was born is not just about Kitty Hawk. Kitty Hawk was the moment. Dayton, Ohio was where it was invented, where it was built, where it was perfected, and where it was ultimately taken for granted. And that gap between what Dayton gave the world and what the world gave Dayton back is one of the most fascinating stories in American history. I've spent a lot of time with the historical record on this one. The Library of Congress has the Wright Brothers' original diaries digitized. The National Park Service maintains both the Kitty Hawk Memorial and the Dayton Aviation Heritage Site. Scholars like Tom Crouch and David McCullough have gone through the primary sources exhaustively. And what you find when you go deep into this story is that almost everything you think you know about how aviation was born is missing about half the picture. So let me fill that in for you. Start at the beginning. Dayton, Ohio, in the 1870s and 1880s, was a mid-sized American industrial city, the kind of place where people built things with their hands and took enormous pride in doing it right. The Wright family lived at 7 Hawthorne Street. Milton Wright, the father, was a bishop who traveled constantly for his church work. Susan Wright, the mother, was someone historians have consistently described as extraordinarily mechanically gifted. She could build and repair things around the house that most men of that era would have called a professional. Both Wilbur and Orville later credited her as a foundational influence on how they thought about problems. She died of tuberculosis in 1889, years before either of them became famous. She never saw what she helped make possible. There's one moment from their childhood that every Wright Brothers biography mentions, and it deserves mention here. Milton Wright came home one day with a small toy, a little rubber band-powered helicopter, a French design called a Pinot model. Wilbur was about 11, Orville was about 7. They played with it until it fell apart, and then they built their own. Something about that toy, the mechanics of it, the way it moved through air, lodged itself in both of them and never let go. Neither boy ever attended college. Neither held a degree. What they had instead was a level of mechanical intuition and intellectual rigor that would eventually embarrass every credentialed scientist in the country who was working on the same problem. By 1892, Wilbur and Orville had opened a bicycle business in Dayton. They repaired bikes, then sold them, then began manufacturing their own models. They called the shop the Wright Cycle Company, and they'd operated it out of a series of storefronts on West 3rd Street in Dayton, ultimately working out of a building at 1127 West 3rd. The shop was modest. They were not wealthy men, but the bicycle business was profitable enough to do something remarkable. It funded everything. Every dollar spent on their aviation research came from fixing and selling bicycles. No university backing, no wealthy patrons, no government grants. Just their own labor, their own savings, their own obsession. And here is the contrast that should make every American sit up a little straighter. At the same time, the Wright brothers were building their aircraft out of pocket in a bicycle shop in Ohio, the United States government had handed a man named Samuel Pierpont Langley, the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, one of the most credentialed scientists in the country, $50,000 to build a powered aircraft. $50,000. The Wright brothers' entire aviation research program, from their first glider experiments through Kitty Hawk, cost somewhere in the range of $1,000. Some historians estimate it was even less. $1,000 against $50,000, a bicycle shop against the Smithsonian Institution. And on December 17, 1903, 9 days after Langley's machine collapsed into the Potomac River on its second failed launch, Orville Wright made the first controlled, sustained, powered flight in human history. But before we get to that morning in North Carolina, we need to talk about what happened in the bicycle shop. Because this is the chapter that rarely makes it into the textbook summaries, and it may be the single most important thing Dayton contributed to the birth of aviation. In the fall of 1901, the Wright brothers built a wind tunnel in their shop. It was a small thing, roughly 6 feet long, a wooden box with a fan at one end. And then they did something no one had done before with this level of systematic discipline. They tested more than 200 different wing surface shapes inside that tunnel. 200! They measured lift, they measured drag, they cataloged results, and they built up a body of aerodynamic data that was more accurate and more complete than anything that existed anywhere in the world at that time. In the process, they discovered that the published lift tables that every aviation researcher was relying on, tables calculated by the German gliding pioneer Otto Lilienthal, were wrong. Not slightly off, wrong in ways that had been sending researchers down dead ends for years. The Wright brothers threw those tables out and built their own data from scratch right there in Dayton, on a workbench surrounded by bicycle parts. That wind tunnel research is why Kitty Hawk worked. Without it, December 17th would have been just another failed attempt. Now, why did they go to North Carolina in the first place? Dayton is where the airplane was designed, built, and refined, so why not fly it there? The answer is practical and reveals exactly how the brothers thought. They wrote to the United States Weather Bureau, asking for locations with consistent strong winds, open flat land, and soft ground for crash landings, because they expected to crash, often, and they needed ground that wouldn't destroy the aircraft or kill the pilot every time. The Weather Bureau pointed them toward the Outer Banks of North Carolina. The Kill Devil Hills area had strong, consistent winds. It had wide-open sand flats. It had soft dunes, perfect for absorbing the impact of a machine falling out of the sky. And critically, it had almost nobody around to watch. The brothers were intensely protective of their research. They were not going to test their most advanced ideas somewhere that competitors could observe them. So they loaded their gliders and eventually their powered aircraft onto a train and headed to Kitty Hawk. And on the morning of December 17, 1903, with a wind blowing at somewhere between 20 and 27 miles per hour and the temperature barely above freezing, they got ready to fly. 5 people witnessed what happened next. 3 men from the local life-saving station named John Daniels, Adam Etheridge, and Will Doe, a local businessman named W.C. Brinkley, and a teenager named Johnny Moore who happened to be passing by. Orville set up his camera on a tripod and asked John Daniels to squeeze the shutter at the moment the aircraft left the ground. Daniels had never taken a photograph in his life. The image he captured, Orville prone on the lower wing, Wilbur standing at the wingtip having just released his grip, became one of the most reproduced photographs in human history. Daniels took it almost by accident. They made 4 flights that day. The first, with Orville piloting, covered 120 feet in 12 seconds. Then Wilbur flew 175 feet. Then Orville flew 200 feet. And on the 4th and final flight of the morning, Wilbur flew 852 feet in 59 seconds. Just under a minute. Just under 900 feet. And then, a gust of wind caught the aircraft sitting on the ground, flipped it, and damaged it beyond repair. It never flew again. The airplane that changed the world made 4 flights and was destroyed by a gust of wind before lunch. They sent a telegram to their father in Dayton. He was asked to inform the press. The Associated Press received the news and chose not to run it. A journalist at the Dayton newspaper judged it not credible enough for the front page. What followed is one of the strangest silences in American media history. For roughly the next 5 years, the Wright brothers continued flying, and the American press continued largely not caring. They came back to Dayton and arranged to use a cow pasture about 8 miles east of the city, a field owned by a banker named Torrance Huffman, who let them use it for free on the condition they shoo away his cattle before flying. This field, called Huffman Prairie, is where aviation actually grew up. In 1904, they made more than 100 flights there. On September 20th of that year, Wilbur completed the first circular flight in history, something they had not accomplished at Kitty Hawk. By October 1905, Wilbur was flying for nearly 38 minutes continuously, covering roughly 24 miles in a single flight. A fully practical, controllable airplane flying repeatedly over a field in Ohio in front of interurban trolley passengers who could watch from the train tracks nearby. The American newspapers remained almost completely silent.
The first accurate published eyewitness account of the Wright brothers flying appeared in a beekeeping trade journal. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A man named Amos Root, a beekeeper and publisher from Medina, Ohio, drove out to Huffman Prairie, watched Wilbur fly a complete circle, and wrote about it with clarity and wonder. He submitted the piece to Scientific American. They turned it down. It was eventually published in his own beekeeping publication, Gleanings in Bee Culture, in early 1905. The first credible journalistic account of powered flight was read by beekeepers. The United States Army was offered the aircraft twice, in 1905 and again in 1906. The Army's review board declined both times without even examining the Wrights' proposals because the Army did not believe powered flight was real. The brothers then approached France, Britain, and Germany about purchasing their aircraft. It was not until 1908, after Wilbur traveled to France and flew publicly at Le Mans on August 8th of that year, banking and turning and circling in ways that left European aviation pioneers stunned, that the world finally paid attention. The French press erupted. Wilbur Wright became an overnight sensation in Europe. American media scrambled to catch up to news their own country had been ignoring for 5 years. That same year, Orville was conducting Army trials at Fort Myer, Virginia. On September 17, 1908, a propeller blade cracked mid-flight. The aircraft crashed. Orville was pulled from the wreckage with serious injuries, a broken leg, broken ribs, damage that would pain him for the rest of his life. His passenger, Army Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, died from his injuries. He became the first person ever killed in a powered airplane crash. Orville eventually recovered and returned to flying. Wilbur never recovered from something else. In 1912, traveling in Boston, he contracted typhoid fever. He was 45 years old. He died on May 30th, 1912. He had invented the airplane and lived just 9 years to see what it would become.
Orville lived until 1948. And what happened in those 36 years between Wilbur's death and Orville's is its own kind of American story. A story about a man watching the thing he built transform the world while spending a significant portion of his energy fighting with the institution that was supposed to celebrate him. Here is what the Smithsonian did. After Langley's 1903 failures and the Wright brothers' success, the Smithsonian, with its institutional pride and its loyalty to its deceased former secretary, began working quietly to rehabilitate Langley's legacy. In 1914, Glenn Curtiss, then deep in bitter patent warfare with Orville, borrowed Langley's original 1903 aerodrome from the Smithsonian. He made significant modifications to it, installed a more powerful engine, and conducted test flights in Hammondsport, New York. The aircraft made short hops. The Smithsonian then relabeled Langley's aerodrome in its display as, in essence, the first aircraft in history capable of sustained flight, implying that Langley, not the Wright brothers, had achieved priority. Orville documented the modifications Curtiss had made. There were dozens of them. He wrote extensively about what he characterized as a fraudulent test designed to rewrite history. And then he did something that must have felt deeply satisfying. In 1928, he sent the original 1903 Wright Flyer, the actual aircraft that had flown at Kitty Hawk, to the Science Museum in London. Not to the Smithsonian, to London. He stated publicly that he would not donate it to the Smithsonian as long as the institution maintained a false claim about Langley's aircraft. The dispute lasted for years. It was finally resolved in 1942 when the Smithsonian published a formal acknowledgement that the tests in Hammondsport had involved substantial modifications and that Langley's original aerodrome had not been proven capable of flight. Orville agreed to allow the flyer to come home from London, but the war made shipping dangerous. The transfer was delayed. The Wright Flyer was finally installed at the Smithsonian on December 17, 1948, exactly 45 years after the day it flew at Kitty Hawk. Orville Wright died on January 30th of that year, 10 months before the ceremony. He lived long enough to see jet aircraft, to see the atomic bomb, to see the early stirrings of the space age, and he died 10 months before his airplane came home.
And here is one more detail about Dayton that has always struck me as a particular kind of irony. The bicycle shop at 1127 West 3rd Street, the actual building where the airplane was designed, where the wind tunnel sat, where Charlie Taylor built the engine from scratch in a matter of weeks because no commercial engine existed that was light enough to fly, that building is no longer in Dayton. Henry Ford, who admired the Wright brothers enormously, purchased the structure in 1936 and had it physically relocated to Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, where it still sits today. He also moved the Wright family home from Hawthorne Street. The two most tangible pieces of the place where aviation was born are in Michigan. The state of Ohio's license plates read Birthplace of Aviation. The state of North Carolina's license plates read First in Flight. Both states are right, and both states have been arguing about it ever since. Dayton gave the world the airplane and watched Michigan take the building and North Carolina take the credit. What does this story mean? I think it means that the most important things Americans have ever done have often been done quietly by people who were not supposed to be doing them in places that were not supposed to matter. A cow pasture outside Dayton, a bicycle shop on West 3rd Street, two brothers without degrees, without funding, without government support, who built a wind tunnel out of wood in a fan and used it to invalidate the calculations of every credentialed expert in the field, who spent $1,000 and changed the world, who flew an airplane over an Ohio field dozens of times in front of trolley passengers while the newspapers ignored them, who then watched Europe celebrate them before their own country fully woke up to what had happened.
Dayton did not accidentally invent aviation. Dayton methodically, deliberately, obsessively invented aviation, and then watched the credit drift elsewhere. The city has Dayton Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, one of the largest and most consequential air bases in the country, built on the actual field where the Wrights learned to fly circles. It has a National Park Service heritage site. It has Wright State University. It has the National Museum of the United States Air Force, which is one of the most impressive military aviation museums in the world, in which almost nobody outside Ohio seems to know exists. The heritage is there. It has always been there. It just requires someone to go looking for it. So the next time you board a plane, think about West 3rd Street.
Think about a 6-foot wooden wind tunnel and 200 wing shapes tested one by one. Think about Charlie Taylor building an engine no one else could build. Think about Amos Root writing in his beekeeping journal because Scientific American would not publish him. Think about Orville Wright, the last man alive who had done the impossible, dying in January 1948, 10 months before his airplane finally came home to America. That's the kind of story they should teach in every school in this country. What other American stories do you feel like got buried, erased by history, or just forgotten over time? Drop it in the comments, because the more I dig into this, the more I find that American history is full of chapters like this one. If this video gave you something you didn't know before, share it, because that's exactly what this channel is here to do. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. I'll see you in the next one.